Sayyidina Muhammad. Inshallah, without too much delay or pleasantries, inshallah, we just want to begin the workshop so we have enough time to cover everything that we hope to cover, and inshallah maybe leave a few minutes for question and answer or discussion. I'll begin by introducing Neelam and asking her quite awkwardly to introduce me. So I'm going to steal this from you for a minute. And the reason why this is important is I recall quite vividly there are certain life moments that you have with your teachers that you can sit with them for a month or a year, and you might just remember one day or 1 hour with them. And I remember sitting in a car with Sheikh Muhammad Yaqubi on the way to a lecture in which I had to introduce him. And so I was actually driving the car and I was asking him to tell me what I should say for him. And he actually just said, started to talk, and then he said, just give me the paper and I'll write it for you. And he said, and then before he wrote anything, he said, I want you to know that I'm not writing this out of any ego or any type of self-promotion. I'm writing this because anybody who you want to speak in front of has the right to know who you are. And so it's an obligation on me, whether I'm a scholar or not is irrelevant, that if I'm hoping and expecting people to listen, that they know who I am. And so mashallah, he's a spiritual giant. But so I took that at heart, and you know, if we expect you to listen or we expect that we can share something beneficial with one another, it's important that we don't presume to be an authority on anything, and we make sure that we introduce ourselves properly as a courtesy to you all. And so, having said that, I want to just quickly introduce Sister Neelam. She's a program director in the Transfer and Transition Services offices at FIU. She works closely with transfer students and partner institutions, organizes trainings and workshops, and teaches a career exploration course for upperclassmen. She's graduated with a master's degree in social work from FIU in 2007. Afterwards, she became employed with a nonprofit organization as a parent educator within a family strengthening program for underprivileged populations. In this role, she's worked closely with both parents and children to help foster a healthy home environment. In 2008, she shifted gears to pursue a career in higher education, while continuing to teach parenting classes part-time for the next few years. She's recently become active within the Muslim community here in South Florida, and she's currently a youth leader at the Miami Gardens Masjid with their youth group, and she serves as, most importantly for us, as an advisory board member for Sana Trust Foundation, influencing all of the programs that Maliha mentioned, and so we're happy to have her as a part of that, inshallah. So I'll hand it back over to you, inshallah, and then we'll begin, inshallah.
So, Brother Rehan Mirza graduated from the Teachers College at Columbia University in New York with a master's degree in social and organizational psychology, augmenting his studies with courses at the Columbia Graduate School of Business and internships with the United Nations in New York and Geneva. He also completed doctoral level courses in clinical neuropsychology at Nova Southeastern University before taking a leave of absence to focus on personal and professional endeavors. He has been honored to be actively involved in the community since his youth. He is well-traveled and has been blessed to sit in the company of great people, great scholars, and great students of knowledge. In addition to learning about his theme, he has seen how great things begin, are sustained, and can grow. For the past 5 years, he has been a social entrepreneur and served as founding director of Sana Trust Foundation, a small nonprofit that is transforming the educational model for school-aged Muslim youth, honoring the social needs of community elders, and serving the needs of new Muslims as well as those reconnecting to their deen.
Thank you. I'll tell you how seriously we take our introductions. These are actually recycled introductions from I don't know how long. And I was like, Neil, let's just use something that we had to do together actually a year ago now. So Jazakallah khair for your time and inshallah for your attention. One thing that's important to as a prelude to anything that we say is that this is intended to be kind of a discussion and reminder. I know I speak for Neelam in this regard as well, for our own families and for ourselves. We're not speaking as an authority. And one of the benefits in doing this as a collective is there's proofs for this in our deen as well. We could all pray individually at home, but there's benefit in praying together. We all do parent individually at home, but there's benefit in coming together to talk about these things. These are shared experiences that we have. The most intimate thing that we can do is pray to Allah, and we share that in common as well. So there are certain practices that are very personal, that are very intimate, that are very important, that are shared experiences. So just like when we come together and pray, there's the barakah and the benefit is amplified. it's important to come together to talk about other shared experiences as well. So this is an opportunity for us to do that, to talk about certain observations and perspectives and maybe a little bit of what we may have learned from our teachers and our own experiences and share that with you, but really as a humble opportunity to share just the experience of raising children, the responsibility and the struggles and inshallah some of the successes that go with that as well. My purpose is to try to highlight some of the more I guess the more inward aspects of parenting and perspectives which at times can be overlooked or forgotten because we're all, for lack of a better word, busy. And so I wanted to just kind of pause and allow us to really reflect on the significance of the role of a parent, the magnitude of the responsibility, which I don't think is lost on anybody, but kind of appreciating the details of parenting. And then inshallah Neelam I think is going to discuss more of the practical application of those things in the home. And so there are three main points that I wanted to make, and inshallah a fourth is just a story that I was hoping to read if there is time permitting. And the first point was just looking at communication as a fundamental of our faith as Muslims, as a faith-based obligation. And the reason why it is because from the beginning of our deen we see that the first moment of interaction between Allah and the Prophet was based on revelation. And so this was not unique just to our Prophet, peace be upon him, but to all of our prophets, from the first to the last, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala communicated with the prophets. Right? There are many mechanisms in which He could have chosen to share a deen or a message, but to understand that the basis of our deen is on a communication that took place between Allah and the Prophet is a significant one. And so that's the theme of this first workshop, is communication. And so we felt that that was an apt place to begin and an important place to begin, that this role or this activity of communicating with our children is something that's a divine quality if we're able to do it. It's something that is experienced by all the prophets with their Lord. And so when our children communicate with us and when we communicate with them, we have this kind of relationship as father and son, or as Amir and son, as leader and son or daughter. And so we have to reflect that prophetic experience. So to understand that the responsibility of communication with our children is something that we see from the beginning of our revelation. We also see that immediately after the Prophet receiving revelation, that form of communication led to a second one, which was dawah, where he was obliged to communicate to his family first and foremost, and then to people who are not related to him. And so again, you see a secondary, or a second emphasis, or a second wave of importance placed on this act of communicating. So I'll pause for a minute by just saying that it doesn't require one to be a gifted speaker. This is not what we're talking about here. Communicating is just conveying a message. And that could be with words, that could be nonverbal communication, that could be through emotion, that could be through attention, care, concern, love, a hand over a shoulder. So it's, I think, important to pause that so that we understand that you don't have to be a Shakespearean speaker. We have actually better than that an example in the Prophet ﷺ. You don't have to be Muhammadan in your articulation and your ability, but you just have to have that concern and the care, and that's what we're kind of trying to emphasize. A lot of times people confuse communication as being a gifted speaker, and sometimes they even feel the pressure of that with their own children. And really, communication is, it begins somewhere far different than the tongue. Communication begins in the heart, it begins in the soul, it begins with emotion. That's where all communication begins. And the last place for it to manifest is usually on the tongue. Right? So again, this is all from the example from our deen, from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, to his own behavior once he was obligated to communicate. He was known as Al-Amin. Like that was his first beginning of dawah, that he had already established an example. He had already established a precedent for communication, which was good character. And so we felt that it was important to just pause and make that point. But to continue, you have another wave of communication that comes into the seerah and into our deen, which is making dua, where after the Prophet's dawah, the next step was for them to connect to Allah. And so you see how human beings are taught to turn towards Allah and make dua. And later on in the form of salah, but at the very beginning just a connection to this one creator, right? And so again, this is all communication, finding out who the originator of communication was, who he taught initially, and then how that person, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, taught us to communicate. So it begins with our connection to Allah, is the point that we're trying to emphasize in this first area of discussion. And then lastly, we all have an opportunity, we will all have an opportunity, whether we are prepared for it or not, is to communicate directly with Allah. And so all of these things that happen up until and before that point are meant to prepare us for that final communication. The understanding and appreciation of the revelation, and to understand that it was a very traumatic event for the Prophet ﷺ, and to really reflect on that moment, right? That communication with Allah is not an easy task. And so to really, all of this to emphasize the importance of communication. That, to finish this point and come back to the beginning, in the Akhirah, we will have our opportunity to communicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that will be based on the preparation and the value that we've given to those things in our lifetime. So you have these four kind of stages, and there are more, and they may be less that we could have emphasized, but we talked about the revelation being the first point of our observation of communication as Muslims. Then we see the Prophet ﷺ doing da'wah within his family and to his community. And then we see him calling towards people to turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through their own dua and their conversation and connection with Allah. And then the opportunity which yet awaits all of us is the opportunity to communicate directly with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is unambiguously clear that it will be a communication with Allah. It won't be anything different. It will be an opportunity for us to answer. It will be an opportunity for us to express. It will be an opportunity for us to ask for forgiveness and to beseech Allah to have rahmah on us. So that will also be an opportunity for us to communicate. But the reason why we decided to begin there in any regard was that the scholars have a tradition when they write their books. Oftentimes they'll begin with kind of a glossary of terms. And any teacher that you sit with will begin by defining vocabulary for that particular science. And the reason for that is to kind of emphasize the value of things. And this is something that we talk to your children and my own son about a lot at Sanad, is to understand the value of things and understand who determines the value of those things. And that's the key to success. And so to understand the value of communication, we have to understand that it's connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The value of anything is correlated with what Allah has told us about it, or the Prophet ﷺ. There's a reason why a black stone is valuable to us. You know, there's millions, billions of black stones on earth, but there's one that's more significant than others. Why? Because of the value that Allah and the Prophet ﷺ have attached to it. No other reason. And that's what Umar radiallahu anh said. I believe it was him that he said, the only reason that you're being honored is because I saw my Prophet honor you. And the same thing can be extended to the Kaaba. The reason why that structure is valued and honored is because Allah has honored that. The reason why the Quran is valued is because Allah has honored that. The reason why our Prophet is honored is because Allah has honored him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So everything is connected in terms of value to what Allah and His Prophet have determined and defined for us. And so communication is an extraordinarily valuable thing. This is the first point that we wanted to make, for parents to understand that, because it can be lost on us at times. To understand the value of communicating in a healthy way, not specifically regarding our children, but in any regard, with our spouses, with our relatives, with our community, but specifically for our discussion today, in terms of our children, to understand the value of that opportunity, that ability to communicate and connect to our children is something that is honored by Allah and the Prophet ﷺ. Because over and over and over again we see the emphasis on communication with our own relationship with Allah. So the second point, inshallah, to continue and make sure that we allow Neelam to have enough time to speak as well, was that to understand that communication is also an opportunity to reflect love, care, and concern. Right? One of these things, I mentioned it, that you can sit with a scholar for decades and remember only a moment or two or three or four. And I remember sitting with one of our teachers, who I won't name, but it was the point of departure, and we mentioned to him how kind of heartbroken we were to leave. And he said that, and these are considered the giants of our time, and he said that just know that the love that you feel for us is only a reflection of love that we have for you. And these are people who are just like, you would think that you're just another one of their students among thousands and thousands and thousands, but for them to be so intimately connected to one individual is one of the most profound lessons that you can learn from real scholars of Deen, the men and women among them. And most of what you can learn is through that type of suhbah. It's not going to be in the books. And honest to God, like I still left so much on the table when we sat with these teachers, but the things that I brought back and hold close to me are those kind of moments of just experiential knowledge, sitting and observing them and hearing them. And so to understand that communication, and that was just a beautiful example that this scholar took in one sentence to use communication as a reflection of love, right? And so that's the basis of our communication. It's not to necessarily get someone to do this, right? It's to make sure that they understand that you love them, that you care about them, that you're concerned about them, first and foremost. The Prophet ﷺ didn't run from the mountain of Hira and tell people to start praying. He didn't tell people to start paying zakat. It was all mahabbah. It was all mahabbah. It was all mahabbah. His fear, his anxiety, his concern, the reason why for 10 years or more he was crying at night in Mecca was just out of love and concern. It wasn't because people were not doing what he wanted them to do. It was out of love, care, and concern. That's it. And so the basis for our communication as parents needs to be one that emphasizes that my children understand that I love them. And so that should be the kind of preeminent objective of communication. And it's the prerequisite to communication. Another example of this is that when we were honored to work in Geneva for a couple months with the UNHCR there, it's an idyllic, out of a movie type of city. Manicured lawns, everybody goes to bed at sunset. Everything's quiet, everything closes. Postcard, like you would imagine it. And one of the things that I recall very, very vividly there was that as we're all dressed in our suit and ties and have our UN badges and we're all busy and we're going here and we're going there, one of the things that I remember noticing one day very, very clearly was that when you pass the train station, the central station in Geneva, everybody looks like a model of a businessman or woman. And there was one area of the train station that caught my attention one day, and it was kind of a bus stop on the corner of the station, and you saw a group of kids that were just like full-blown goth mode, wearing black fingernails, piercings, this and that, and it just was a complete contrast with everything else surrounding, And I remember pausing there one time, figuring out why is that happening? Why is it that we're all dressed up, we all have, mashallah, good positions with the UN, and everybody's busy and going on the train and doing this and that, and then you have this group of kids that are there and everybody just passing around them, and they're in stark contrast to everything around them. And my conclusion was because they know that people don't care about them, and that they could do what they do there, and the whole world can continue to spin, and people will go to work and come back, and nobody will care. And when we feel that our children are slipping, when we feel that parts of our community are slipping away, this is the reason. Because the reality is that we're just kind of making our tawaf around dunya, and these kids begin to feel that nobody cares about them. And that's when the distance starts to happen. And so, I think it's an example that we should kind of pay attention to, because if it can happen in places like that, right, where you feel like it's the utopian society, economy is good, architecture is beautiful, history is there, weather is amazing, snow-capped mountains all around, if it can happen there, it will, and it is happening in our homes and in our community. And like those kids in Geneva, the fact of the matter is, it's just that children begin to feel that you don't care about them. And this is kind of the problem. And so we have to know that we pay attention. If the locals there, one of them, once a day, just stopped to talk to those kids, you would see a transformation in their lives. Right? You would see them dress differently. You would see them engage in productive activity. You would see them put away their cigarettes. You would see them, maybe engage in something productive, rather than just, twiddling their skateboards and smoking cigarettes and doing drugs on the side of the corner, right? But nobody did, and nobody does. And you could probably go there today and you'll see that still happening. But how do we kind of foster that personal, intimate connection? It's by being genuine, by being sincere. You know, Prophet ﷺ, I think Sister Tika mentioned it, ad-deen nasiha, that our deen is sincere concern, right? These are the kind of the basis that our children need to understand through our own practical application of these prophetic things. If we've never expressed these emotions to our children, then any type of communication is going to be hard, right? You can't just one day, you know, start to connect. But if you've never expressed concern, if you've never stopped to pay attention, then it's going to be very, very difficult for you to have any real conversation, any real communication. The Prophet ﷺ, when he would walk anywhere and anyone would stop him, including a young person, he would stop and turn his whole body. He wouldn't even just turn his neck and say Assalamu alaikum. He would stop and turn his whole body. And the prophetic wisdom in that is that to show that you give someone your attention, right? And so for our children, we have to give them our attention. And you know, this is where that metaphor from Geneva extends to our own homes. That we actually have to stop. You know, the Prophet ﷺ, there's a beautiful hadith, we don't have time to talk about it, where the young Sahaba, his bird had died and he was crying. And the Prophet ﷺ was walking from point A to point B and stopped everything to give this kid his attention. And he lowered himself. And there's so many nuances to the hadith that we don't have time, but just the fact that he stopped, turned his whole attention, lowered himself, made eye contact, like on and on and on, just shows you the amount of attention that is required to have effective communication. That it can't just happen. That you have to physically actually participate in your communication. And these are things non-Muslims will tell you as well. It's just that they're embedded in our deen, so it's a point to just remind and reflect. So the first point that we made, just to recap, was that communication as a fundamental characteristic of faith. And the second point that we wanted to make was that communication as a reflection of love, care, and concern. And so third and last, for my part at least, we wanted to share with you, I saw it recently, you know, one of my teachers, Habib Umar, Allah preserve him, he said that, you know, he's not anti-social media or technology or these things. He's actually quite involved, but he obviously advises much caution. But sometimes you can find hikmah, and the Prophet said hikmah is the property of the believer, so when you find it, hold on to it. And so there are things that you can find that are really wise. And so I came across something on social media that was one of these memes or infographic that talked about children children are often, I'm going to paraphrase, but children are often not very good listeners, but they're very often excellent imitators. That children are not often good listeners, but they're very often good imitators. And so this is the third point that we wanted to make, is that children should be very, very easily be able to observe your communication. How do you communicate? How do you communicate? We'll start from the bottom up. How do you communicate with other individuals, friends? How do you communicate with your spouse? How do you communicate to other children in the home? But most importantly, how do you communicate with Allah? And how do you communicate with His Prophet ﷺ? That children should be able to observe this, that this is what they will imitate. And so, you know, almost more effective than any words that you can communicate or express are the communication that you allow them to observe in you. And so it begins with them observing our communication with Allah and His Habib sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with our spouses and with our own friends. You know, how do we communicate with our spouses? How do we communicate with our friends? How do our children observe us communicating with Allah? That they should observe normal, healthy communication with Allah. Communication that's not extreme, that's not you know, extremely capricious, where one day it's, you know, you're knocking out 100 rakats and for 100 days you're not praying, you know. That they don't observe this extreme communication with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That they see a normative, tradition-based, consistent communication with Allah. That's sincere, that's personal, that's intimate, that, you know, that they can understand without you speaking to them. They should see your communication with the Prophet ﷺ, through your salawat on the Prophet ﷺ, through your modeling of his example as both men and women. He had qualities that could be defined as masculine and qualities that maybe modern interpreters would describe as feminine, modesty and haya and these things. And so how do you reflect your communication with the Prophet ﷺ? They should observe a brokenness in front of Allah. You know, the Prophet ﷺ was, one of the Sahaba asked him, he was showing emotion. He was shedding a tear and crying out of the loss of family. And one of the Sahaba thought it was out of kind of machismo that he had never cried after having so many children or family die. And he said, that's nothing to be proud of. This is out of rahmah, you know, that one show this concern, that one show this emotion. And so, and we have other hadith that talk about the Prophet crying and crying profusely, with his beard being drenched in tears and the ground being soaked. You know, we have other hadith. And so how did these hadith come to us? You know, the hadith where the Prophet left out broken. Like, how do we know these hadith? Because people observe the Prophet in a state of brokenness with Allah. And these things have had such a profound effect on you because you're able to observe them now 1400 years later. So when a child is able to observe you broken in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, don't underestimate the impact of that. Because for 1500 years and more, we will be impacted by the process of brokenness. Right? And so they should be able to observe you at points in your life, desperate in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, beseeching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, I'll share with you a funny joke, because we're getting kind of serious right now. I remember one time my mother-in-law was visiting, and I was in the room, and I don't know what had happened to me, but I got into mood to like do some salawat on the Prophet ﷺ, and I think I had started to recite a qasida or something like that. And my mother-in-law, God bless her, she's one of the people that I feel is very close to Allah. She was coming out of her room and I think passing my room and had heard me and I think paused at the door. So I did not plan it, but alhamdulillah, I think I won some brownie points that day. And so she went and I think told my wife that, you know, Rihan, kya kar raha hai, what is he doing, this and that. And so, you know, never underestimate the hidden benefits of showing your love of Allah and the Prophet in a private way. You know, if your son or your daughter observes you, it will have lasting impact for them. Lasting. I mean, and think about the way that you and I are still impacted by these hadith that talk about the Prophet's concern, his tears, his hurt, his pain, right? And so they should observe this brokenness on occasion as well. Again, you know, you have to be moderate and make sure that you know, relative to your children's age and things like that, that you translate certain things that maybe they misunderstand. But to continue with these last few points before I hand it over to Neelam, they should also see conflict. I mean, we've seen this in the time of the Prophet as well, through the lives of the Sahaba. They should see conflict, but they absolutely 100% should see resolution. This is the key. Not to hide conflict, not to pretend like it doesn't exist, but they absolutely need to observe resolution. Whether it's between your spouse and you, whether it's between a family member and you, if they heard it and they've seen the conflict part, it's your opportunity to equalize the balance the equation. That they should see resolution. And you should make it a point to do that resolution in front of them. Conflict is going to happen. I mean, you know, we would all be liars if we said that we've never had a point of conflict with our spouses, with our relatives, even with our child perhaps. And we would all be liars if we said that our children never observed that, right? And so that's not anything to be ashamed about. What we should be concerned about and we should be mindful about is if they never see the resolution part of that equation. Right? They should see you have a proper resolution with your wife or your husband. They should see a proper resolution with your parents or your in-laws. They should see proper resolution with your siblings or another child. That's very, very important. And so that is just a point of on conflict and resolution. They may also observe in you anger, right? Which is also nothing to be ashamed about. I mean, this happened. There's hadith about this. They happen in normal, healthy, good societies, companion societies. But they should see how you challenge it and how you moderate it and how you extinguish it, right? And without going, you know, the hadith about it, but you can refer to those hadith, how to manage anger and to how to put it in its place. They should also see as an equilibrium to that, joy. genuine joy and happiness. And what are the things that you're happy about? If they see you just jumping up and down when the Miami Heat and Miami Dolphins win, which is not often, but when they do see you do that, and that's the only point of joy that they see in their father, that's a problem, right? They should see you happy when the Prophet ﷺ is mentioned. They should see you happy when one of the children does something good. They should see you happy when your spouse does something that you genuinely appreciate. And they should hear that, and they should see that. It's like one of our scholars, he said that people are so scared and have this so much trepidation when it comes to loving the Prophet ﷺ, but they have no problem in jumping up and down when their soccer team shoots a goal, right? They're all jumping down and they're all like clapping and they're expressing all this love and joy. But for men to show an expression of love to the Prophet ﷺ, it's like they're stuck in an emotional prison, right? So our children should see both anger and joy in us, genuine things. And again, it's attached to value. So what they see you happy for are those things that Allah has valued and encourage you to be happy for, right? And so, lastly, inshallah, that they should feel a genuine sense of rahmah. And so this is all under the third point that we made, and I'll repeat them, but the last point under this third kind of headline was that they should see rahmah as the core value that you express to them. Why? Because it's the core value that Allah has expressed to us. That's it. There's no other explanation that needs to be done. No metaphysical research or scientific-based analogy needed, because the Prophet ﷺ has taught us that in every salah we're repeating Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Because Allah, in a variety of hadith Qudsi and in the Quran, has emphasized His rahmah. That they should see and feel in you a communication of rahmah. That is the overarching theme of your existence in their life. That it's not discipline and justice, right? If you want Allah to be like that with you, then reflect a lot of that in dunya. But if you want Allah to be merciful with you, then show a lot of rahmah in dunya with your children. And so that should be the kind of core quality of our communication. Rahmah, rahmah, rahmah. And so just to recap, and then inshallah I'll hand it over to Neelam and give her about 20-25 minutes as well to speak, that communication as a fundamental characteristic of faith, communication as a reflection of love, care, and concern, and that we should be conscious that our children will imitate our form of communication. And so be conscious of what we communicate to, how we communicate it, and why, inshallah. And so these were some of the, hopefully, some of the inward aspects that we wanted to remind myself and my family about. And keep in mind that I'm a Sanad prep parent, just like all of you, as is my wife. And so these are reminders for myself, inshallah. And I wanted to ask, inshallah, Neelam to speak and talk about some of the more outward aspects of communication, some more practical applications of that, inshallah. And then we'll break for Maghrib at 5:45, inshallah. So, bismillah. You're welcome.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I want to thank first and foremost Brother Rayhan and Sister Atika for allowing me this opportunity to be able to speak a little bit about something that I am so extremely passionate about and that I have for years really wanted to talk about. And I warned Brother Rayhan that I have a lot to say, so I can get tangential, I can start talking about things that I probably shouldn't be talking about, but it comes from a passion for this, and the realization that there's a need. There's a need in the community, there's a need everywhere to really focus on what is happening with our kids and what we need to do as parents and family members, and how we can take small steps to try to start making changes in the right direction with the type of interactions that we have with our kids. And it does start with communication first and foremost. And so that is some of the stuff that I want to touch on. Communication is so broad, and I know that you guys hear it all the time, right? If there's ever conflict in a marriage, if there's any conflict in any situation, whether it's at work or at home, it's communication, right? Learning how to communicate effectively with people is the solution to the problem. But we hear that and we don't know anything else, right? We don't know the steps that you need to take to communicate better, and what does communication entail? There are so many different pieces within that larger umbrella that, like I said, I can go on and on for so long because there's so many areas within communication that we can discuss, but I tried to focus on specifics that I think will be beneficial to all of us. Like Brother Rayhan said, this is a reminder first and foremost for us and for myself, and more for me now because I'm still a fairly new mom. I have a 2.5-year-old and a 3.5-year-old, and every single day is a struggle. You know, it's tough. It's tough when you know this stuff, and I taught it when I wasn't a mom. And to apply it is a lot more challenging, you know, and to make sure that I'm able to do what I need to do as a mom and really set a good example. So what I want you to think about as I go through some of these topics is, you know, first and foremost, why we do something like this. Like, why do we go over these topics in parenting and raising kids? And then what is it that you want for your children? You know, the fact that you're here is big enough for us, right? It shows that there's an interest and there's something there that you want to implement in the home, or even listen to see what maybe you can do a little bit differently, right? Or to even see if what we're already doing is kind of right? But think about the long-term goal. What is it? What is it that you want for your children? What is it that we want them to accomplish when they're older? You know, definitely having a good career, being well off, but more than that, you know, what do you want for your children? So just keep that in mind as I kind of go through some of these topics. The first thing I wanted to talk about is within communication, realizing the type of attention that we tend to give our children. And I think that you all will agree that we notice the bad more than we do the good, right? So we always catch them doing something wrong. I don't think we skip a beat with that, right? The minute they do something wrong, we catch it. And we're on it, and we're ready to tell them that they did something wrong, right? How many times do we actually stop to find them do something good? In all honesty, you know, and I'm talking about it on a day-to-day basis, not once a week, on a daily basis. Do we find a moment in that day to notice something good that they did? And I promise you they do something good every day, but we just don't notice it. Why? Because we're so fixated on finding what they do wrong and correcting behavior that is not good. It's not bad, you know, and I want you to know that as I say this, I'm not coming down on anybody. This is something we do. It's human nature, right? We want to correct behavior. But a good way to correct behavior is to notice the good and encourage that, you know. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the model here at Sanad. I always think about the model at Sanad. And how even here you have the focus on strengths as opposed to focus on weaknesses, right? And I encourage you to start thinking that way even at home. If we focus on the child's strengths and the things that they do better at, the weaknesses tend to sort themselves out slowly, right? And that's kind of what happens here too, right? The subjects that the children do well in are the ones that they get to choose to do first often, right? And then the other ones are ones that come after. And so if we focus on the children's strengths and maybe this at home as well, we'll see that those areas that they're weaker in will tend to solve themselves slowly, of course with a little bit of help. There's no perfect formula, but it starts to happen. And so what I want you to think a little bit about is, instead of constantly telling them what they're doing wrong, and believe me, I catch my kids doing wrong all the time and I want to correct it all the time, try to find moments where they're doing good. And when you do find those moments that they're doing good, you're building their confidence. Every time you catch something that they've done and you're showing that you appreciate it, because parental approval is really big in their eyes, especially when they're young, you're going to see more good behavior, right? So communicating that. When we're focusing only on the bad behavior, it becomes kind of a vicious cycle, right? So if I'm communicating to my child that what they did was bad, then I'm getting upset and they're realizing that the only way that they're getting attention is when they do something bad, right? That's the only way that I can get my mom's attention, is if I do something that she doesn't like, then she's going to look at me. My son does it. He starts throwing things because he knows that after work, the only way he's going to see anything from me is if he throws a few things all over the house, and then I'll turn around, right? So that becomes a cycle. Then my reaction is probably not the best after work, right? And then it turns into this constant vicious cycle of negative behavior, negative response, negative behavior, negative response. But how do we get into the more positive area, right? So that takes me to the topic of praise. And really using praise constructively in the home. There are two types of praise. There's praise for being, and praise for doing. So praise for being is focusing on a child just for who they are, their temperament, their personality. I think everybody here, if not everybody, most of you here have multiple children, and you know that they're all very, very different. We know identical twins that are completely different when it comes to their temperament and their personalities. And that, in and of itself, you know, when you're dealing with them and when you're praising them, your praise should be a little bit different too, right? Having that cookie cutter approach is probably not the best way with kids because they're so different. So when you praise a child for being, and I think this is really important to understand that it needs to be done in moderation, right? We don't want to tell our children they're the most amazing people in the world and constantly say that, right? Because then we fear them kind of going into this area of narcissistic behavior. But letting them know that they're good people, letting them know that they're loved and that they're special and that there's something about them that's unique. You know, there's really nothing wrong with that. It's actually good, again, to build their self-confidence. And even maybe finding a quality in them that's a little bit different from the siblings because it makes them stand out, right? And it makes them very special. The other thing is praise for doing, which goes back to finding them doing good things, catching them doing good things. I think sometimes we unknowingly kind of set them up for failure. We don't present enough options for them to do well, right? So that we could praise them. There's not enough for them to do that they could show us that they've actually done something well and so that we could praise them. I always think of this one example of a parent who said, you know, she used to ask her son to help her clean the bathrooms because he liked to do it. And so it was a point of pride for him because he really enjoyed doing it, and it was a great way for her to get some help around the house as well. And she asked him to do it, and every time it came to wiping the faucets, she was very particular about how she needed them to look. They couldn't have any water stains on them or anything, right? So she would expect them to be sparkling when she came in. Now this child is about 7 or 8, okay? She'd walk in and they were not. They were not perfectly clean. They had little smudges on them, but he did his very best at that point, right? And her reaction was always negative. It was always, you call this clean? Like, you know, this isn't clean. This isn't what clean should look like, right? And that really just killed the child's confidence. She basically gave the child the opportunity to do something he enjoyed doing, but even in that moment, took that away from him, right? By telling him that what he did was not right. So that, you know, having age-appropriate expectations. If we want them to do well, then we need to set them up to do well. If we're setting them up to fail every time, then we can't praise them for doing good. We can't praise them for being good, for having learned the things that we've taught them, you know? So age-appropriate expectations is a really big thing. Like I said, I can go off on a tangent, so I'm not going to talk about that now. Maybe that'll come, you know, another day. But we look at things from our eyes way too much, you know, and we don't understand that a child at the age of 7, that was the cleanest he could have probably ever done. To him, that was the best thing he could have done, you know, and so we really need to lower our standards when we're thinking about the kids and thinking about their success in their eyes, okay. I talked about building confidence, so all of that kind of ties into that. And you know, why is it important for us to have children that are confident? You know, we need children that are confident, that are going to be able to hold their own when they're out there, when we're not there anymore, you know, and that starts now, as early as 3, 4, and 5, and you know, this is when it starts, because if we're starting to break down that confidence this early, it will carry through. We'll see signs of it later. Going back to the idea of your children being very different, if we speak a certain way that may not be the most desirable way, it may not affect one child at all, because that child's just very different. Their temperament's very different, and they kind of just don't care, right? But it may affect the other one so badly that you start to see it slowly, you know, in the younger years as well. And the reason I honestly say that is because I see that in my own kids. They're very, very young, but I already know which one is affected by anything and everything I say and which one is kind of like, oh, you know, let it slide, I'm going to do what I want to do, you know? So keep that in mind. And so that kind of brings me to my next point. We all love our kids unconditionally, right? I hope so. We all have unconditional love for our kids, right? Sometimes. No, hopefully, inshallah, I hope that, you know, all the time where we have an unconditional love for our children. And we have to be very careful that we show that to them, because we know that, but they don't know that. They don't know that our love for them is unconditional. And if we respond to certain things in a certain way, then the love begins to seem conditional, right? So if I do good, then I get the response that I want, then I'm loved. If I do bad, then I get a negative response and I'm not loved, right? Because that's how they equate that. They equate your approval to love at that age. That's all that they're thinking, right? So an example, when a child does something, again, an undesirable behavior, I don't like saying misbehaving all the time because they don't always misbehave. It's just in our eyes that they're misbehaving. But they're not necessarily, because in their head that's really not what they're doing. They're usually exploring and testing their limits. But what's very important is that when they engage in a behavior that's undesirable to us, it's important to focus on the behavior and not the child. So the behavior was not desirable. It's not that the child is not desirable at that time. And I promise you, a lot of times they think they're not desirable. Why? Because we use words sometimes that aren't the best. So something as simple as good job versus good or great job versus good boy or good girl, right? It's good boy or good girl seemingly is very, you know, yeah, I'd say that to my kids, right? But when we use that when they do well, and then we say bad boy and bad girl when they don't do well, we're defining them, right? We're defining their person at that moment. And so it's better to identify the behavior and appreciate the behavior, or not appreciate the behavior. So I don't like what you did, but it's not necessarily saying I can't stand you right now, you know? Because again, in their heads, that's conditional love. So keeping that in mind. Labeling. We use a lot of labels, positive and negative ones, and I think this for me is really, really hard because this really does affect children more than we know that it does. And when I talk about labels, I talk about, you know, and the way I was saying with kids being very different, like there's one that we know requires a little more attention or needs an extra push, needs an extra nudge, needs to be told over and over again what to do, right? One may clean the room as soon as they wake up without you even asking them, or make their bed, right? So like these are little examples, but that often leads to labeling children, being like, you're so lazy. Why can't you be more like your, right? Comparing. Or you move so slowly, you know, why can't you just pick up the pace a little bit? Or even positive, what we think might be positive, or saying, you know, you're such a perfectionist. Even that, you know, can have a very negative connotation, especially when it's coming from a parent and it's coming over and over again. So being very cognizant of the words that we're using and how regularly we're using them, because a lot of times when children hear these words over and over and over again, and they know my mom thinks that I'm like this, right? Because my mom has said this for about the past 10 years. It becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They start to fulfill that, because if I'm being told that I'm extremely lazy, then I'm probably going to act like I don't care anymore and truly just become lazy. That does start to happen. Children will start to do that. They'll start to behave as that label that you've kind of assigned to them when it's years and years and years of hearing the same thing. Okay, and then the comparing to others. Keeping in mind that we should never be comparing our kids to other people's kids. We shouldn't be comparing them to siblings. They're all very different. They're all very unique. They all have very special traits that that we really want to try and show them that we appreciate. You know, one might be better in one area, but that doesn't mean that the child that you're having struggles with doesn't have their own, you know, their own very positive attributes that you can work with. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was communicating our own feelings, and then this goes back to a little bit of what Brother Rehan was saying about showing children, not being afraid to show children our own emotions, but of course being, I think, in some situations careful about it, or if we weren't able to, like let's say if there was anger but it got really heated and it got really bad, definitely showing that resolution is an extremely important piece. Showing that, okay, this happened, but this was the outcome of that action. But more than that, how we communicate our feelings to our children. So if something was done, whether it was between spouses or between a child and a parent, for the parent to verbalize that in a way that does not blame the other person. Because we're very quick, again, it's I think human nature, we're very quick to put the burden of our feelings on somebody else and say that you make me feel this way, or it's because of you that I feel this way right now. It's because of you that I'm acting the way that I'm acting. And the reality is the way that we feel or the way that we choose to act because of something that's happened, it's all within us, right? And so you may have heard of I statements versus you messages. So the I statements are an exercise that you try to, it's hard, it's not easy, but you try to rephrase your words to say that I feel this way because of what happened, instead of saying you did this and that's why I feel the way that I feel. Because it takes the ownership off of you completely, right? It's completely because of that person why you feel the way that you feel. And that's not fair, because people do certain things and it makes us feel a certain way, but the reality is we are responsible for our own thoughts and feelings and how we choose to deal with things. So trying to rephrase how you tell your children and even your spouses how you feel. And it's really hard with the spouses as well. It's really hard. You really want to say, no, it's because you did that, but it's important, and it's actually a very cleansing process. I have to tell you, when you take ownership of some of this stuff, it really, really makes you think twice and 3 times about everything that you're saying and everything that you're doing, because you're taking ownership of your actions. Acknowledging and recognizing feelings in our children. This is really, really important at a very young age, I think. If a child feels sad, it's okay for them to feel sad. If a child feels frustrated or angry, it's okay for them to feel frustrated or angry. There are many times where we see, especially little boys, when they cry, right? If they fall and they cry, that usually a dad, will pick up the child and be like, you're a boy, why are you crying? You're not supposed to cry. Boys don't cry, right? We hear that a lot. And that is not fair at all, because if a child's hurt, and even if they're not hurt, but whatever happened in that moment that made that child cry, we have to validate that, and we have to be okay with the fact that the child needs to cry it out. It's an emotion, and we don't want to suppress emotions, because suppressing emotions can lead to a lot of other things later. And it always takes me back to, a few things that Brother Rehan touched on multiple times, and I kept thinking about this too as I was putting this together. The Prophet ﷺ cried a lot. He cried and cried and cried in front of people often, right? Yet we're raising our boys not to cry. We're telling them they're not allowed to cry because boys don't cry, right? Until one day they grow up and they see you fall apart because your mother passed away, right? And so those are the messages that if we want to be consistent, we want them to know that we're human and it's okay to cry, that even at that very young age, we want to start delivering that message. And I know a lot of this, it sounds very like, oh, really? Like, do we really need to do that at such a young age? Like, does it really matter? And it goes back to those things. Maybe with one child it doesn't. Maybe one child you can tell them, you know what, stop crying, get over it. And they'll get over it, and they'll be perfectly fine. But another child may be so sensitive that they will internalize that one statement for so long, and you won't even know it. You know, and again, going back to my kids, I have to be very careful because I know one child, it would destroy that child if I did not acknowledge the emotion that that child was experiencing. So keeping that in mind as well, and then encouraging and supporting the healthy expression of feelings. So because you're angry doesn't mean you can, yeah, it's okay to be angry, but you can't start throwing things, right? So how do we communicate to them that you can feel the anger, but how you respond to it is what we need to work on. What my daughter does now when she cries is, and I do a lot of self-disclosure, I'm sorry, because I think the examples help, you know, and you're able to apply them a little bit to your own situations. But what she's learned to do that helps her feel better anytime she's crying, if she's having a tantrum and she's really losing control of herself because she's crying so much, is to ask for a napkin so she can wipe her tears. And that is enough for her to kind of calm down. She'll always say, I need a towel, I need a towel. And so I'll give her the towel and then she'll wipe her tears, and that's when I know, okay, she's like one level below where she was before. You know, and so if she's able to do that, then I know that she's working through her emotions, right? And again, that can go into so many other ways. How do you deal with that when a child is, we'll probably save that for another day, but when a child is going through that, you know, what are the steps that you take to kind of help them through that? When do you ignore it? When is it just best to, okay, clearly there's something else going on here, but we can get into that later. So I think I tried to run through that because I didn't want to get too fixated on any one section, but going back to the idea of, you know, why this sounds so like nitpicky, it sounds so like, do we really need to do that? Because it sounds funny. Like if you really start talking like this to your kids, you're like, you listen to yourself and it's weird. It's a weird way to communicate because we're not used to that. But you know, I've heard a lot. I get a lot of pushback from people about this, and it's always like, you know, you make kids so weak and so sensitive when you talk to them like that, because you talk to them like so politely, and you know, first and foremost, the Prophet ﷺ always go back to that. He spoke to people. He's the prime example. How did he communicate with people? How did he talk to people? It was always in a very sensitive manner, especially with children. You know, we have so many hadith that teach us that he never came down on children. You know, he always tried to teach them in a way that was beneficial for them to really understand it. And you know, that's what's so important to me first, is that, you know, all of everything that I talk about here, in some way we can tie it back to the way that he ﷺ spoke with children and with people in general. And secondly, that, you know, it's actually doing the opposite. It's not making them more sensitive, and it's not making them more weak, because when you're allowing your children to express themselves and you're teaching them to express themselves in a healthy manner, you're actually strengthening them at their core. And that's what we want to work on. We want to strengthen the kids at their core now, so that when they're older, it's that well-adjusted child, right? That inshallah, that child that's able to actually go out into the world and hold his or her own, is able to have a productive conversation and not kind of cower, isn't afraid to express themselves, because that happens, you know. And this isn't a foolproof, you know, model or anything like that. Things happen, you know. Our children are going to go through things. There's society that they're dealing with. They're going to run into a lot of things out there that are going to pose struggles for them. But if the foundation is set at home, and if it's stronger at home, and they feel comfortable expressing themselves at home, then the likelihood of them overcoming those struggles is much higher. I promise you, it is much higher. They may face struggles, but if they have the support of the family, they have the support of parents, they will do much better, inshallah, with that support. So I hope that helps a little bit. I feel like I breezed through it, but
no, you did a great job.
Any questions or anything about specifics? Yeah. Walaikum assalam.
Jazakallah khair. Very informative and timely. We learned a lot about facilitates this. One question that I had is, how do you balance or resolve expectation and lowering standards? Because that's what you had touched upon. So when we lower the bar, what is the long-term impact? How do we move on from them?
Lower the bar in terms of what? What do you mean exactly?
Meaning earlier you said that if they're achieving only certain levels, and your expectation is higher.
How high are your expectations? I think the question, at some point you have to ask yourself that question as well, right? How high are your expectations, and how can you work on your expectations for there to be an easier compromise?
What I'm trying to say is that children have lower expectations, and if that is met and you're constantly praising them, how do you expect them to go to the next level?
And that's why I said with praise, we do have to exercise that in moderation. You know, praise does come with, it can come with some consequences as well, you know, when it's used too much. And so when you're focusing on praising the behavior, but also working with them to better themselves, right, because that's part of the process, or to better themselves in a certain area, then they will most likely try to do it on their own because they want to please you. So they're going to try to excel naturally, to try to please you and to continue to please you. So I think it's a lot in the way that you deliver the message to them. As you're talking to them, also letting them know that this isn't, you know, that there is that need to build and to make ourselves better as human beings or in a specific area. I don't know if that helps. I think I'd need a more specific example to be able to.
As an example, let's say a child is getting a B or a C and you want them to go to the next level. You just praise them, yes, that you have passed, and now that your expectation is met. How do you go about progressing?
So, I mean, when we talk about focusing on strengths, it's also, you know, from a holistic perspective, and this is something we've done at work, where we've done training with even employees, you know, because when you look at employees, it's a lot like the supervisor-employee relationship is a lot like the parent-child relationship. And when you focus on an employee's weaknesses, you know, you see that they have a harder time doing better in that area if you don't pay attention to their strengths. And that's the same with the children. So if you see a B or C in an area and it's consistently, you know, a B or a C or maybe a C, right? Because a B, at least for me, I don't think that that's too bad. What other areas did they get A's in? You know, and can we act like we maybe didn't even see that C the first time, or saw it, but it was like, okay, well, you did amazing in these areas. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about what led to the A in this area, this area, this area, and then make the C or the B the latter discussion. That should come later, but the focus should be on the things that they did better in. Because sometimes we'll go straight to the negative, right? And we'll lose sight of the good stuff that they did. You know, we see that a lot, where it's like, oh, you got to see here, and it's like, hello, do you see all the A's? You know, do you see everything else that's on the paper? So kind of flipping the approach sometimes, but not completely ignoring it. Obviously, also talking to them about what can we do together to help you, you know, in this area. And maybe Rehan can touch on this a little bit more because he works with students here. So
yeah, what I would just say, first I just want to tell everyone that I know Maghrib has come in, so we'll just make that the only question, but we can follow up after Maghrib, so we want to make sure that we get the prayer. But I would just comment quickly. I think Sister Neelam added enough, and then try to wrap up the workshop. But to the question that was asked, I think that one of the things that we try to emphasize here at Sanad, and what I try to do at home, is you try to pay attention to the effort being made and not so much the kind of result, because that's how we're going to be judged. You know, Allah is at the end of the day going to judge our effort and how sincere we were in that and how honest we were in that. And so that's first and foremost, to you know, observe the journey and not necessarily kind of where they ended up. And if the child has made an honest, sincere effort, that's the point of emphasis. But if they're shortcutting it, if they're being dishonest, if they're, you know, doing something that was unbecoming, then that's a point of concern. Not so much the result of where they arrived to, but how they arrived there. So I would emphasize that first and foremost, to see how honest and sincere they were. Because I've seen kids that are just trying very hard, and they land where they land because For all of us, Allah decides that. Allah has the X mark where we're all going to land. So, but what He does expect, subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the effort to be there. And so we should reflect what Allah is expecting of us and our children. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that as parents, and especially as fathers, we have to be very, very informed about our children's abilities. I've dealt with parents who are just completely oblivious. The fathers have no clue what their children genuinely are capable of doing. And in some cases, the worst case scenario, where they have actual disability, have a cognitive impairment, or they have a certain struggle that's unique to them, and that's fine. But the problem is not that they have a struggle. The problem is that the fathers or the mother or the parents, both of them, are so oblivious to that fact. That's the bigger issue. Because, at the end of the day, we're such a extraordinarily detailed creation of Allah, from the molecular level to, to the greatest level. So many T's had to be crossed, and I's needed to be dotted, and DNA needed to connect. For us to just arrive to the point that we can have this conversation, that we have to pause and just be grateful, for our children and who they are and what they are. Because, as parents, we have to just appreciate the fact that they're there, Certainly behaviorally, if children are being dishonest or cheating or cutting corners or being lazy, those are things that we need to help them. So the journey part of it, and then the results are with Allah. So that's just my 2 cents, but I think Neelam actually added more of the actual practical benefit and approach. But this is just, I think, inwardly what we need to observe before we kind of become the executioner, so to speak. I know that there may have been 1 or 2 questions, but we have to pray. Obviously, that's more important than anything. So what I would just like to add, finally, is just that, look, these workshops are, and the reason why we make them mandatory is that Sanad is, we're trying to do things a little bit differently. We know that as Sanad is the sum of its parts. And so, like I was talking to one of the parents and learning coaches earlier, that the objective of this is that if we do this all together, and we all together as mothers and fathers and as parents make an effort to move 1 inch forward, then that's how the community moves forward. And so we could have not done this, we could have not made it mandatory, but Sanad is a collective. It's a collective of parents with a shared ideal and motivation and purpose. And so we're hoping that as staff and administrators, many of whom, almost all of whom, are actually parents of Sanad Prep parents as well, that we all move together in some form or fashion, so that at the end of the day, when we're long gone, that we've left our children a little bit in a place that's a little bit more forward than where we were. And so, this workshop is done with a great deal of humility, but we make it mandatory for ourselves as well, because we only feel that, if we take it seriously, that's when we know that the results will come in our community. And so the last point that I'll make is that communication is hard. It is hard. It is very, very hard. There's a reason why the Prophet was crying so many nights. Okay, if it was easy, he wouldn't have been crying so much. And it wasn't just him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was all of the prophets. There are some prophets that couldn't even talk to their own families and get through to them. So it is hard. This workshop is not the solution. This workshop is to be perspective inwardly on it and outwardly on it. But caring is not hard. Right? All the prophets cared. Peace be upon them all. And that's the prophetic quality that we're trying to emphasize here. Not to be the greatest speaker and communicator, but to be the greatest person who cares in your child's life. And so those principles that we highlighted today must always be valued and must always exist. And lastly, to understand for myself and my family and for you, that to be a parent is a divine gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you and I have been chosen, and that we've been raised in maqam for a purpose. And so, we have to be very serious about that purpose, and inshallah share what we can of benefit so that we all achieve the goal, which is at the end, like we say at Sanad, for our students to be pleased with Allah and that Allah be pleased with them. That's the goal, inshallah. So, inshallah, having said that, we just want to extend our gratitude to all of you for attending. Make dua for Sanad. After the prayer, we'll make a few announcements, but for now, inshallah, we'll get to the prayer and just express our gratitude to all of you, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Oh yeah, thank you. Is Sean still? We'll pray here, so if the sisters can just help by pushing the tables back. And then if the brothers can help by just pushing the tables back. Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Yeah, everybody. Okay.